I think that sex is a human right, like so many other human rights and a part of humanity. And I think it's a terrible shame that we're not modeled to talk about it. I think it's a terrible shame that we're not educated about it. But I don't think the answer is to just not talk about it. I like to say that foreplay can be core play. There have been studies that have shown that women can fantasize their way to orgasm without ever touching themselves and give themselves hand-free orgasms.
Welcome back to the Rena Malik MD podcast, your source for evidence-based information about your sexual health and more. I'm Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon. Today, our guest is Dr. Ian Kerner, licensed psychotherapist, nationally recognized sex therapist, and author of the New York Times best-selling book, She Comes First, and more recently, So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex. Today on the podcast, we talk about what you need to do to have good sex and what you need to know to pleasure your female partner. What it takes to keep sexual interest, desire, and that spark alive during your relationship. How to talk to your partner about sex, introduce novelty, and maybe even pornography or non-monogamy if that's what you're into. We talk about what your sexual script is and how can you use that to find out what you can work on to have better, hotter sex. Now, before we get into the interview, I just have a small request. If you guys are enjoying this podcast and you've listened to at least one episode before, make sure to subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you're listening or watching. This is a huge way for us to reach more audience members and grow the podcast. And it is completely zero cost. So thank you guys so much for your support. And I hope you guys enjoy today's interview. We start off talking about what are the most essential components of having good sex.
The most essential components of having good sex. Well, to me, good sex, Rena, is an act of mutual absorption. Getting absorbed, getting into flow, turning off your conscious mind and allowing the body to take over in ways that are unconscious and intuitive. So I haven't answered the question in this format before in this way, but like thinking about what are the paths to absorption. For example, many of the couples I work with, they're just expecting to sort of show up and have sex. And of course, they don't necessarily have desire, and then they wouldn't necessarily have mutual desire. And so a lot of them don't end up having sex because their thinking brains are just so active. There is no space for getting turned on or interested in sex. And then sometimes I have couples who show up and they go straight to intercourse. They undress themselves. They barely have any kind of foreplay or above the neck or above the waist connection. And they're just jumping into intercourse, and it's feeling, again, they're not getting absorbed. Their thinking brains aren't turning off. So I think the path to the essentials of great sex are first off to really create space for it, where you can turn off your brain, where you can relax, where you can luxuriate, where you can know you can have some time ideally. And then I think the key is to simmer and to percolate. I mean, even if you're into like really hot, kinky sex or fantasy-based sex or taboo sex, or you want to have something that feels passionate, just giving yourself the time to become absorbed, to simmer, percolate, whatever the momentum, whatever the experience is. And then I think it's sort of knowing each other and being able to dance. In our profession, so much gets emphasized on newness and novelty. And I do believe there is a strong role for newness, novelty, and unpredictability. But I also think that there's just as strong a role for familiarity, consistency, predictability. It's like knowing how to tango. Like you got to know the basics, and you got to be able to anticipate your partner and know them as a dancer. And then you can really start to improvise and work within the forms.
I asked Ian, how do people really learn the basics, particularly in a culture where people don't communicate much about sex?
So few of my patients, actually myself included, grew up in sex-positive homes where sex was modeled in a healthy way, where it was discussed in a healthy way, where it was considered a very human and real part of life. Most of us grew up in either sex-avoidant homes, meaning we're bringing shame to sex, or grew up in sex-negative homes, meaning we're bringing shame to sex, or sex-avoidant homes where sex just simply wasn't discussed at all, which is the case with me. And so we arrive at sex, I think, excited, but totally unschooled, totally unfamiliar. And I think that that's where we have to talk about it. I think that that's where we have to talk about it like we talk about anything else. What have we learned about our preferences? What do we know about our sexual selves? Some of us know a lot, and some of us don't know much. As we are having a sexual experience, how is it feeling? What hurts? What doesn't? I mean, so many women, especially, experience painful sex. So many young men that I meet who have no problem masturbating, they can wake up with erections. They're so nervous and anxious about how is it going to go that they're unable to get erections, and they avoid sex altogether. So I think that there is a basic level of communication that needs to happen. Sometimes I will encourage couples to think about what it is that they like and want, to start to think about how to say that with language that's a little sexy, and then how to frame it in the form of a fantasy. So if, for example, I love giving my partner oral sex and she seems reticent or nervous or hesitant, or I don't know what I'm doing, I will think about that. I want to be able to give her oral sex. I want to be able to go down on her. I want to be able to, I'll start to evolve the language, and then hopefully I can express it in a sexy way. I could say, hey, I really have this, fantasy of what we can do, or this idea. So the beautiful thing about talking about sex is the language itself of sex can be really arousing. And that's where psychological arousal comes in.
I brought up that talking about sex can be awkward, uncomfortable, and unnerving for a lot of people. So, what does Ian suggest that people can do to help them get over those fears?
Honestly, Rena, I think you just have to sort of take a sex positive attitude and do it. I mean, I think you have to think about yourself as a sexual person, get to know yourself as a sexual person, learn about yourself as a sexual person, and advocate for yourself as a sexual person just the way you would in any aspect of the relationship. I know it's scary. There's a lot of things that are scary. It's scary to say to somebody, hey, are we serious here? Can I call you my girlfriend? I'm thinking about my fifth date with my wife 25 years ago. That was a scary conversation. We've had plenty since then, but I think that we really have to, dive into the communication. Nobody is intentionally trying to harm the other. I think it is scary. I think we are fragile and vulnerable during sex. I think it's important to understand that there are primary emotions happening. So underneath someone's frustration might be a feeling of neglect. Underneath someone's anxiety might be a feeling of fear. And just to approach these conversations with enormous human empathy. I think that sex is a human right, like so many other human rights, and a part of humanity. And I think it's a terrible shame that we're not modeled to talk about it. I think it's a terrible shame that we're not educated about it. But I don't think the answer is to just not talk about it.
Find that many people live in this quiet sexual desperation. They'll be in a relationship that they're sort of unhappy with and their sex life isn't great, but they just won't talk about it. And I think that we as a society and as human beings owe it to ourselves, because sexual health is health. So being intimate with another human being is not just about sex. It's about how your overall health and how your body functions, how you feel, and how you relate to the world. And unfortunately, there are real world implications for having that sort of connection with a human being that's just beyond procreation.
As a sex therapist, sometimes all I have to do is a single session with a couple to get them talking. And sometimes I'm amazed. I could be sitting with a couple who's been together for 10 years who have never had this conversation, who have built up resentments, who have so many different ideas about why what's happening might be happening, and they've never really talked to each other. But again, it's tough to break the ice. But once you break the ice, the water isn't cold. The water can be warm and loving.
I was first introduced to Ian by his book, She Comes First, which is sort of a how to guide for pleasuring women. So I asked him, what are his top tips that people should take away about providing people with the most pleasure?
I think the first thing that I would say, some of the tips are actually what I said at the very outset about creating a relaxing environment where you can turn off the thinking brain. But I think, one thing is to think of outer course as a complete act of lovemaking, to think of intercourse as a behavior that you can engage in, but it's certainly not required. And you don't have to build an entire sexual event around this one behavior. So I like to say that foreplay can be core play. I think men and women often do cycle through the process of arousal differently. For women, they have the capacity to have multiple orgasms. I think blood leaves the pelvic region more slowly than it does for men after men have an ejaculation. So I think this idea of she comes first, of being courteous and making sure your partner has been pleasured works. I don't necessarily believe that orgasms have to be simultaneous or synchronous. I don't believe that they have to be delivered by any one single behavior. I don't think that very, very powerful behaviors like oral sex should be underestimated or pushed to the side or just considered, appetizers in advance of the entree of intercourse. I also think that a key component we were talking about earlier, talking about sex in a kind of cognitive, communicative way. But I think that there's also the element of psychological arousal. I mean, there have been studies that have shown that women can fantasize their way to orgasm without ever touching themselves and give themselves hand-free orgasms. When I'm working with men who have erectile unpredictability and I give them homework assignments, one of the homework assignments is either to imagine something really sexy, to listen to something really sexy, to watch something really sexy, but to not touch themselves. And men are able to get very strong, very robust erections just through their imagination and through their senses. So why do we leave that behind when it comes to sex? Why do so many of us become tongue-tied and silent and afraid to engage in fantasy and commentary about what's happening? It's funny, I was working with a couple who had a really hard time just talking during sex, dirty talk. She wanted a lot of dirty talk, and he was very uncomfortable with that. And I happened to see them a few weeks later at a restaurant eating. And the way they were eating was so sexual, like sharing the food and giving each other forks and spoons and commenting. It was a really lovely restaurant. And so when I got to see them, I said, you eating a meal was probably sexually hotter than actually having sex, because there you were able to really talk about everything that you loved about the food. Why can't you do the same thing during sex? So I think that psychological arousal is something that often gets underestimated. And especially I hear from a lot of female patients who, again, don't just show up with spontaneous desire, ready to have sex. There's a process of really turning off that thinking brain. And so I often hear that fantasy and psychological arousal, it can be as simple as watching some couples porn together too, or listening to an erotica podcast. But whatever it is, that there's not enough attention being paid to, again, making love to the brain, turning off that thinking brain.
I always say foreplay starts in the morning. So you need to be showing your partner you're interested. It could be a sexy text, a casual touch of the shoulder or the lower back, just to show your partner that I find you sexually attractive. However, in longer term relationships, your partner becomes someone who's safe, someone you trust, someone you look to for care even. And that's not always synonymous with sexy. So you have to build that intimacy and cultivate desire. And what's so interesting to me is that people really hesitate to work on their sex lives. So I asked Ian, what do you say to a person who simply defaults to saying, I'm not connecting with my partner, but I'm unwilling to change?
Yeah, I mean, I probably will tell them it's not worth having a second session. I mean, here they are coming in with complaints, usually about a lack of sex, but then there's this idea that you shouldn't have to talk about sex, or sex should be organic and spontaneous. You should just have chemistry. And I will really try and explain differences in desire framework. I think the way the media depicts sex, I think the way that sex can be very early on in a relationship when there are very few stressors. I mean, if you think about, everyone is always talking about how natural sex was or how hot it was at the very beginning of a relationship. Well, I've been married for 25 years. And when I first met my wife, great, all we had to do was show up, have fun together, have a great dinner and go have sex. Now life is filled with so many different complications and stressors. So I think it's ridiculous to assume that a long-term relationship is just going to have spontaneous automatic sex the way you do in the early days. I mean, you really have to collaborate on eliminating those stressors. But then I think that there is a natural difference between how, in general, men experience desire and how women experience desire. I think men experience desire in ways that feel highly spontaneous and reactive. A single visual cue can turn us on. My wife comes out of the shower and she's wearing a towel, and I see her and I register that cue, and it really it really metabolizes in my body in a way that if we have time and she's interested, let's go. But you know what? My wife's desire is not spontaneous. She's a very sexual person. She's attracted to me. But when I come out of the shower, she doesn't get a visual cue that metabolizes in her body in the form of desire in the same way. So her desire is more responsive. It emerges from that simmering of arousal, that percolation of connection. So there really needs to be a runway into sex, I think, in most long-term heterosexual relationships. And sometimes, very often, sex does not begin with desire. Certainly from both partners. Maybe one partner feels desire and is tapping the other partner on the shoulder, but very often for the other partner, or sometimes for both partners, desire begins with willingness. Desire begins with motivation. Desire begins with putting yourself through the motions and then letting yourself turn on. That's how responsive desire emerges. And so I think you do have to make time for that. I think you do have to work at it in terms of, this is a ritual that we care about and prioritize. In my home for years, Sunday dinner was an important ritual. It was something we prioritized. It was also work for everyone to come together. But my wife, my kids, the preparation. But you know what? It led to a beautiful family meal that we had week after week that we could count on. So I think the benefits are there. And, all work, it's like work you love what you do, have sex, it's work, but there's a benefit to it.
For women, oftentimes arousal comes before desire. So a partner has to be willing to be aroused and willing to participate to start feeling desire. If you're in a loving relationship and intimacy is built into that relationship, desire often comes as you start feeling aroused.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you raise a really good point, Rena, which is for so many couples, sex begins and ends with the event itself. What about all the time in between a sexual event? So there are studies that have shown that couples who have sex once a week have higher levels of relationship positivity than couples that don't. So let's say that having sex once a week is a nice target on average. Some will want it more, some will want it less. But what happens in the 6 days between sex? Where does your sexuality go? Where does flirtatiousness go? I sort of call it the erotic thread, the energy that connects sexual events. And I think the problem is that people think that thread or those moments, those little erotic charges that you can have, are automatically invitations to have sex. So if you show your sexual self at all and you're not planning or wanting to have sex, then you're extending an invitation that's going to be frustrating in one way or the other. And so I think we have to create a non-demand environment. And I think that is sort of the beauty of having sort of a little more of a ritual around sex. So, the other days, hey, we can be sexy with each other. We can be flirty, or we can tell ourselves, hey, we're not going to have sex this week, but let's let me come up behind you and give you a kiss from behind, or let's just fool around and make out a little bit, or share some text. I think this is where we get back to sex avoidance and sex negativity. I think any mention of sex can sometimes be anxiety provoking, but most of the time, sexiness and sexuality is not an actual invitation to have sex. It's a way of being and allowing that energy into the room.
There's an interesting study that I read where they had sex therapists watch 20 women walk, 10 who had vaginal orgasms and 10 who didn't. Based on their walks, the therapists were able to guess which women were capable of having a vaginal orgasm correctly about 80% of the time. And this, they believe, is because they were more fluid in their movements, they were more energetic or free. And I think there is something to the way you carry yourself when you're open to sexuality that's a bit different than when you're not.
Yeah, I think becoming comfortable with your sexual self. I'm thinking of a couple of female patients who are really successful. They work hard at work. They work hard at their relationships. They've achieved a lot. They work hard at the gym in some cases and are doing their best to look very good. But their sexual selves have been left behind. They don't have, I think, what you described, just that integrated feeling that their sexuality is with them. So I think that there is something to be said for just having good sex and knowing it's a part of life and just allowing it to integrate with all the parts of your personality.
Ian previously talked about a sexual script. So I asked him, what exactly is a sexual script?
When I'm working with couples and we're doing sex therapy, very often I will ask them to tell me about the last time they had sex. I want them to describe a sexual event in vivid detail. When did when did the sexual event happen? Where did it happen? How did it happen? Did it start from like a place of heat, like a hot start? You just came and ripped each other's clothes off? Was it like a warm start, like cuddling on the couch and watching a show and just sort of starting to feel that connection? Was it a cold start, like we don't have desire, but we have willingness and motivation? Let's go. So I'm very interested in how a sexual event gets launched. I'm very interested in the activities that get engaged in, certainly above the neck in terms of talking to each other, watching something, psychological arousal, kissing. I mean, so many couples tell me that they used to love making out with their partners, and now there's no more room to just kissing has gone off the menu, right? So I'm very focused on how is that initial arousal generated? How are we turning off our thinking brains? And then once we're aroused, how are we moving below the waist and building arousal through oral sex, outer course, manual stimulation, intercourse, who's having orgasms, who's not, what do the moments after sex look like, what is the erotic thread, that connection. So basically, I'm really trying to anatomize or dissect a sexual event, because when couples come in with problems, one partner may be experiencing painful sex or not having orgasms. Another partner may be suffering from early ejaculation or erectile unpredictability. Generally, the problem is being reinforced by the sex script. And so if we can adjust the sex script, if we can add more of an arousal runway, more psychological arousal, if we can move into outer course as opposed to intercourse, if we can adjust and edit the sex script, we can help create better sex. That's fundamentally sort of how I think about a sex script, because I sort of think of it as like sex in action. Sex is something that couples come and they want to improve, they want to have. It's an event that they want to experience. So let's talk about sex in action, and let's look at previous events of sex in action.
I asked Ian, what sort of things do you tell people to sort of look at or write down, and how can they audit their own sexual script to identify areas where they might be able to use some more attention? For example, more foreplay or more time for arousal.
I mean, that is not to like pitch my book. It's not my plan. I don't plan to come here and promote a book, but my book, So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex, is really a beat by beat breakdown of sex scripts and sort of how to think about them and how to communicate and how to create them. I think sometimes people feel like the concept of a sex script is too limited or too structured. But again, I'm just talking about sort of like the basic choreography. And I think that there's a real, when sex works, when our sex scripts work, I think that there's something really beautiful and deep about them. And when they're not working, I think that's when we are sort of miles apart in quiet desperation. So I do go through it quite a bit in the book. I would ask people to also think about sort of your erotic personality. Like, what is your sexual personality? Like, sometimes I'll be sitting with a couple and one person might say, I just want to know her fantasies. I just want to know what turns her on. I feel like she's holding back. And the person right there might be like, I'm not holding back anything. I don't really have a ton of fantasies. Like when we're having sex, I mean, I might say I enjoy watching some porn or reading some erotica or something, but when we're actually having sex, I just love like the sensual arousal and getting lost in the physical sensation. So that can be somebody's fantasy of sex, but they might be with a partner who is more kinky or psychologically oriented and wants something in terms of like a scene and a setting that has a dynamic of power or voyeurism or exhibitionism. So in addition to sort of thinking about what are the behaviors we engage in a sex script, it's also thinking about like what are our erotic personalities.
Ian mentioned that your erotic personality can stem from a lot of different things, like your social upbringing, your attachment style, and multiple factors. And there's not really one right or wrong way to be.
Everyday personalities are coming, like I get a little like nervous before doing interviews, or I tend to use humor, or people might associate me with being intense. Like, how would you think about yourself sexually? Are you funny sexually? Can you laugh at sex? Do you laugh in the moments in between sex? Are you able to be self-deprecating about it? Are you intense? Some people are thrill seekers and adventure seekers, and they love to like climb mountains or jump out of planes. Like, think about your personality and think about how that might be generalizable possibly to like your sexual personality.
I then asked Ian about initiating sex and how sometimes you'll see that there's some videos where men on TikTok are slapping their partner's butt and the partner's not turned on. But ultimately, it's just the man trying to make it fun and playful, but it doesn't land right. So, what is the right way to initiate sex?
One complaint I hear is that a lot of couples are playful about sex, but kind of like in a jokey, kid-like way, or in a way that's not really sexual. I think it's coming more from a place of like nervousness. Like, I've had a lot of couples that go into like cutesy voices around sex, and one or both partners are sort of turned off by that. But I don't think that that's really about being sexy or sexual. I think that's like the anxiety of having to bring our sexual selves in the room. Conversely, I talk to a lot of men who are really worried about consent. And if they come up and, want to push their partner out down on the bed or make out or something, they're worried about not having asked permission. And what's ironic is I hear from a lot of women who really want that kind of passion, especially in the context of what you said, a secure, attached, familiar relationship. Like, we know our partner isn't a rapist, like maybe at worst it's the totally wrong moment, but hopefully in a good relationship, like our egos can tolerate it, because I think that there has to be a place for passion and expressions of lust in secure, attached relationships.
Having a sexual script and a roadmap to what sex is going to look like often includes what works for both partners. And it's often that people find themselves doing the same thing every time because it works. I think the important thing is that's okay. If it's working and you're enjoying it, that's great. But I asked Ian, how do you handle boredom in the bedroom? How do you get out of a sexual rut?
Again, I mean, I think that there is a beauty in familiarity, but I think a lot of couples do fall into the same kind of sex scripts and same sex ruts. So I think you have to communicate if you have an idea of what would be sexy. Sometimes it can be sexy to take turns as givers and receivers and not focus on necessarily this, totally synchronous act of generating arousal. There's a lot to be said for variations on different kinds of erotic massages that can be anything from very sensual to extremely kinky. And I think you can learn a lot about your own tastes and your partners. I think sometimes it's time to add more psychological novelty. For a lot of couples, it's not that they can't get off once they're going, it's just sort of like the trip is boring getting there. So this is a couple that needs some kind of call to action, some kind of wake up call. And that's usually for some form of relationship excitement, psychological arousal. Again, it can be side by side in the form of listening to something, reading something. I am a big fan of porn for couples, ethical porn for couples when it's used to sort of build that arousal. More and more couples are also becoming sort of sexually adventurous together. They're going on apps like Field and finding opportunities to play with other couples or go to parties. And, there's a lot of events that happen, at least in major cities, that, ride a line between sort of dancing and sex and are really meant to sort of be very erotic events. So I have a lot of couples who, are sort of taking sex outside of the bedroom together. We're sort of talking about, sexual adventurousness. And it's hard if you've been in a long-term relationship and you started off, totally pair bonded and monogamous to think about something that's like sexually adventurous outside of the bedroom. So again, I think that there are ways to start inside the bedroom. It's also hard when the problem has become such a problem and a source of resentment that it's hard to muster the willingness to engage playfully. So many couples come in angry at each other around sex, and yet one of the essential qualities of sex is a playfulness. So it's very hard. I would really encourage people not to let sex problems linger too long, because then they lead to a resentment that's hard to come back from. And then you have couples coming in and one partner is frustrated and it wants to propose an open relationship. And that's not the kind of I work with couples on open relationships. I'm totally down for non-monogamy and non-traditional relationships, but it has to be coming from a place of love and compassion and empathy, and not just, our sex life sucks, we need to open up this relationship. That's not going to be the ticket to a successful open relationship.
While people have lots of strong emotions about pornography, ultimately porn can be used as a tool to help arouse, increase desire, and introduce novelty. I asked Ian how he suggests that partners discuss porn use in a way that's palatable.
Yeah, that is that's hard. Even when I'm sitting with couples and we're talking about porn and both partners are interested, you can feel sort of judged by coming in and saying, "Well, here, let's watch this." So I often give a fun assignment, which is to during the week, sort of view porn and find scenes that you think would turn on your partner based on what you know of your partner's erotic personality, and to have fun with it. I think, again, it's a conversation where you just have to break the ice and say, hey, I was listening to this podcast and these two experts really recommended watching couples porn and they made it sound really fun. And I think, most of the couples I work with, I would say 75% tend to be interested in exploring this stuff. Sometimes one partner is a little more of a passenger, a little resistant, but I think we're really afraid of being sort of shut down by our partners and shamed and embarrassed. But I got to be honest, the vast majority of people that I work with are kind of open to giving stuff a try.
By the time someone gets to Ian's office or a sex therapist's office, they're already at the point where they're sort of willing to try something. So I asked Ian, what are some tools for the average person to help them discussing sex with their partner?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I will advise somebody that's bored with sex or wants something different, to wake up in the morning and say, hey, I had a super sexy dream about you last night. I don't know what my unconscious was up to, but man, was my unconscious, getting kinky. And so already you're sort of, it's like that show Severance. You're sort of, the outie is kind of blaming the innie for the sexual fantasy. And then, hopefully you have a partner that's interested in hearing about that dream, whether it's right then and there or I would love to hear about it later. I mean, the problem is if you have a partner who's not interested in your sexual dreams, that's another issue. But hopefully then you can describe something really hot and sexy. You don't have to say that it wasn't really a dream, that you made it up, but describe something then that you think your partner is going to find sexy and hot and inviting. And so that's another way. And then from there you can say, maybe we could find a movie clip or something of a scene like that. I mean, there's definitely ways to sort of, take small steps into the shallow end of the pool.
We always say novelty is super helpful, but introducing novelty can be a great way to break this rut. But in some cases, it can be the other side. Novelty can be stressful for some people, and it can make it more difficult to get into the flow state that Ian talked about earlier in the podcast. So I asked Ian for his advice for addressing novelty in a way that reduces that stress and anxiety so that you can still get into that flow state for great sex.
I think I mentioned some of the ways that I've tried to do it, which is mainly introducing psychological arousal in a side-by-side way. I think also we're living in a world where we can have sexy date nights. We're living in a world where there's, incredible toys that are being really well made that are a lot of fun. I mean, here in New York City, I'm often giving my couples date night assignments to go to the Museum of Sex, or if lingerie is something that makes a female partner feel sexy and a guy likes it, to do a lingerie buying brunch on Saturday or something. But I think it's the little details that can trigger our imaginations. But novelty is only novel if it, is something that we anticipate, some kind of reward to the brain. I think that we have to do more than just bring, sometimes I'll be working with a guy and he thinks novelty is pulling out a vibrator. Well, a vibrator can be the least novel thing to his partner, and maybe it's a little novel to him or novel in the context of the partner relationship. But I think you have to take the next step and connect the accessory, whether it's lingerie or some kind of a toy or something related to BDSM. You have to be bold enough to connect it to your imagination and to say, I think that this is really sexy because, if it's not connected to imagination, then it doesn't have heat. Introducing a vibrator and saying, I want to, tease and titillate you and edge you to orgasm, but not let you orgasm. And maybe I want to blindfold you and tie you up while I do that. Then that's to me, adding a little bit of heat. But without that, it's just a clitoral stimulator, like anything,
I asked Ian, what are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I am seeing my patients, which is always exciting, and not worrying about, writing a book. I have been thinking a little bit just about the importance of lust in relationships and how lust is something that often gets deprioritized, these days when we're picking our lifetime partners. It's something that gets prioritized maybe when we're in a period of hooking up and a period of casual sex. But I am sort of interested in working with lustless relationships, which are different than just low desire relationships, where desire is there or was there or can be found again, versus something that wasn't necessarily there from the first place. So I'm playing around doing some writing. I write pretty regularly for CNN, so I usually have an article in there.
As a follow-up, I asked him, how would you describe lust as different from desire?
Well, lust to me is it's the chemistry, it's the heat, it's the why we are attracted and why we pick each other out of the crowd. Lust is often, the seed of love. So I think that there is something magical to it. And hopefully that lust, certainly leads to desire, but hopefully that lust continues, to have an afterglow so that we can access desire. I think desire needs lust to exist. And I think lust is that chemistry, that attraction, that thing that we can't necessarily put on our checklist.
When you're in a long-term relationship, lust can sort of dwindle a little bit because things tend to change, right? And you might be having altercations with your partner or other things that are happening that are just dimming that lust. So how do you bring it back? I think that's a really interesting question.
Hopefully, if it was, it's interesting, like when there's infidelity involved, the couples who have attraction and lust seem to be the ones, in my experience, who have the best chance of healing, because somehow sex can be a really healing activity. I think what's really hard is if that initial sort of big bang of lust wasn't there. I mean, I don't think you can really marry your best friend and expect to feel tremendous sexual desire if there wasn't some kind of heat in the beginning. So, yeah.
If you're interested in learning more about Ian Kerner, check out his website at www.iankerner.com or check out the link in the description. Thank you guys so much for joining us on today's episode of the Rena Malik MD podcast. If you guys like this episode, make sure to share it on social media and tag me so I can see it. I love hearing what you took home from the podcast and your best parts of the podcast. And as always, remember to take care of yourself because you're worth it.